Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net. And today's video is a collaboration video all about the shadow motivations that go into personal development, spiritual development, and self-growth in general. Now, this is a collaboration between myself and Alex Shailer, who has his own YouTube channel covering similar topics to the one that I cover on mine. He's also a life coach and he's a friend of mine. We've been friends for about a year now, and we've always had really good conversations, but we decided to do a collaboration together. So I'll go ahead and get right into the video from here. Make sure you check it out.
When I was much more identified with all the mental chatter in my head, my motivations would be based more around like a small me in this story that needs met in some kind of way, whatever needs I was focused on at that point in time, trying to maximize enjoyment in life. As I've gone on, of course, that's still there. I'm sure I have all my egoic, materialistic motivations, but I've discovered, how important things like, for me personally, I think of words like ethics and justice and virtue and positive contribution. And does that mean I'm going around trying to save the world? Not necessarily, although that would be nice. But I'm not sure I'm up for it. I don't have all of the skills necessary, but I do have the skills that I have. And I think everybody has their particular skills. And when they marry up those skills with some kind of like motivation inside to execute on those skills to help people positively contribute or get justice or be an activist for change or create some kind of conscious business, I believe all of us have something inside that we want to give, which can then funnel through our skills. So it's thinking about, the deeper values
Absolutely.
that keep society together, and tapping into what is really needed in our society. That could be something for someone.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, I know that when I first started off with like personal development, there was a lot of focus toward almost like trying to pick myself up out of like low self-esteem. Like, I wouldn't have called it that consciously, but it was always this sense of like, oh, I have to somehow prove myself not inferior in some way. And so this always like held me back, like personal development wise. But in recent years, since I've like kind of started to untie some of those shadows for myself, I know that some of the things that you had just mentioned, about like focus toward justice and focus toward, things just outside of myself have become a lot more tangible for me. Like before, it was like the need was so great for me to prop myself up that it was hard for me to really focus on other people. And this is something that I see like a lot of like younger people go through, like people in their early 20s and that kind of thing. And I think, you know, if someone embarks upon like the process of becoming more conscious and getting more in touch with their authentic motivations, they start to naturally flow in the direction of more compassion and more connection and that kind of thing. Mhm.
Yeah, I really find that I never saw it coming, but a lot of the kind of motivation comes from this sort of deeper realization about the self. This is a journey that a lot of people go through on different kinds of spiritual paths. There's progressive paths, there's much more direct paths to the self. But once you start becoming aware of yourself, becoming aware of your own awareness, and you kind of tap into the nature of that awareness, you start to ask yourself questions. What is the nature of the ground of my being? There's a stillness down there. There's a kind of a subtle intuition, a subtle flow. If you're doing extreme sports or something like that, it's probably going to mess you up if you're thinking too much in the process of climbing this wall without ropes. You need to be deeply into the present moment and deeply intimate with your experience and your senses in order to not die in that situation. But we kind of, we can take something from that in the way that it shows the power of intuition and flow, which comes from, this deeper aspect of ourselves that we can tap into with meditation and mindfulness. And then the kind of ethics kind of and the motivation and thinking about justice and contribution kind of flow naturally because they're like a reflection of that. If you're looking at the essential self in this, seeing its quality of stillness and seeing its quality of peace and the subtle intuition, you naturally want to take on activities that reflect that. And you're naturally wanting to be effective, so it makes sense to try and actualize on things within your current skill set. And it's usually the things that you're interested in anyway are your skill set, and then from that stillness and intuition through what you're good at and what you love, there you feed into the contribution, which brings personal development with actual meaning that's in line with your actual values, as opposed to trying to chase this vision of happiness in the future or whatever it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, in line with what you were saying, I know that when I was very individually focused in terms of like, oh, I need to get to a certain point where I'm acceptable and I can achieve this and do this and that kind of thing, there was always this existential dread that was underneath the surface because all of this stuff that I was like, sort of pouring into the pot of like trying to develop myself, I would automatically like kind of go into this notion of like, oh gosh, well, one day I'm going to die. And, then what's the point in all of this stuff? Why am I pouring all this effort into something that's temporal? And so in that would just make me really uncomfortable, and I would just try to block the thought out, and I'd be right back on the grind. And then after I had realized that that's not necessarily the right way to go about things, not the healthiest way to go about things, when I realized a lot of shadows really were informing my desire to basically puff my own self up, you know, at that point, a lot of that infrastructure that kept me like sort of reaching into the future with things that weren't necessarily in my flow, all of that just sort of broke away. And now it's like my personal development, even though I still have some ego coming into that for sure, it's like there's so much more about like, oh, what kind of impact can be made? It's not so much like what kind of impact can I make? It's more so like what needs to happen to make things better, and so it's very like practical more than it is like about like me and like being this person and that kind of thing. And that's ultimately been like the process for me is like just getting really, really honest with myself about my motivations. And there's still some of that there. There's still like, kind of the ego that wants to keep itself alive through doing things. But I think
Mm-hmm.
as I make it to where it's not so easy to flow my motivation directly through the ego, it's sort of like all of that kind of like breaks down a little bit, and it allows me to actually go toward, okay, what do I actually enjoy and what needs to happen in the world, like you had said.
Yeah, and I think it's good to check in with yourself every so often and reflect on what your motivations are, and more specifically, where they're coming from. Is this in line with what I actually want to create in the world? Or am I trying to satisfy some kind of short term need that, the need for may well be just dissolved with an element of consciousness? And that's, I guess that's where people talk about stepping outside your comfort zone. You become aware of these kind of impulses within you to satisfy these short-term needs, which take you away from this, should I say, like deeper purpose that's more reflective of who you truly are at the deeper level. Um, and I think what's important is to tap back into that and give as much awareness and consciousness as possible to the impulses that may just be satisfying a short term need. That Definitely. When you do step into that space where that need's not being met, you do experience that discomfort. But the way I've kind of grown to look at it over time is that we call it discomfort, but it's just a sensation that's in our awareness. And once we get to that stage, it's not so much this laborious task of stepping outside your comfort zone all the time, because who would want to do that? You know, that's probably another personal development trap, to kind of fall into this mindset that we've got to be permanently torturing ourselves in order to be growing. But growth also, you know, comes from the inspiring moments, comes from the flow. We don't have to be in this kind of like place where we're holding back our happiness or anything like that for the sake of this, for this growth. It is much more pure intentions, and much more easy flow comes in when you just bring yourself back to that presence and ask, like, what's the next step? Where am I feeling pulled towards? What is the most effective use of my time to make some kind of like contribution, not to just fulfill this like sense of self, but because it just flows naturally.
Absolutely. So, in the sense of like sensing that something is wrong, right? So when it comes to like motivation, there's a sense of like there being like either you're the horse that's like chasing the carrot out in front of you, and you're going towards something you want, or you're the horse that's getting whipped and you're going away from something that you do not want. And so I find that when it comes to these shadow motivations, a lot of them come from like trying to get away from something you don't want. And so when you sink into that present moment, you realize that it's a lot of just your mind interjecting things that are not true, that are basically projections of the past, like past traumas or limiting beliefs in some way. And so when you drop into that present moment, it basically starts to dissolve anything that's not real. And once you subtract what's not real, you're left there with just that pull, that intuitive pull toward a direction that just is basically what this machine is meant to do. So what
Mm,
you're good at, what the world needs, and also what's going to give you the most inspiration doing it, I find is like the right wave to be riding, into developing yourself, because it gives you a purpose outside of
mhm,
yourself for doing it. You're doing something in service to something, and you become a bit like the knight, like the knight in shining armor on the mission of love, in that way. So
mm,
I think, with that, it you can you can very easily with personal development end up down in that shadow, in terms of trying to mitigate some scary reality, that's not actually true, by
mhm,
trying to constantly feed the hungry ghost. And it leaves you with this sense of like constantly needing to be in that hamster wheel, like you had
mhm,
mentioned, this constant need to be out of your comfort zone and striving and struggling and this and that. And it's not sustainable. Like if everybody on the planet were doing that, like it's not, nobody's benefiting from that in that sense. It's only when people are really getting into alignment with what their mind body complex is trying to push them to do, like what's really in their spirit. So yeah, I totally agree with what you'd said. And I think, in terms of, consciousness work practices that are all about centering in the present moment, centering in being, that's what really helps to weaken the foundations of many of those inauthentic drives. Well, inauthentic, everything's authentic, but not
mhm,
necessarily in alignment, let's say.
mhm.
All right, so that's all we have for today's video. Make sure you go in and check out Alex's channel. He's got a lot of great stuff on there. And I'll go ahead and I'll link a subscription link in the end screen of the video, as well as a couple of my favorite videos from him. So be sure to check him out. And until next time, keep becoming more you.